All right, so week 8. The first thing that I did this week is I went in and I fixed the bug where the bird avatar would just fall from the sky when you press the root note, right? And that's now removed from the game, and it's fixed and it's working great, which is good. We like it when bugs get removed. After I went in and I did this quick little fix, I started working on the projectiles, or excuse me, the particles for the feather projectile. There we go. Gotta alliterate your P's there, right? And I knew from last week that I needed some sort of plumage to be exploded outwards from the bird when you shot this projectile, right? So I went in and I made a very basic plumage projectile reusing the bird projectile sprite as a particle sprite. And those shoot outwards with the feather projectile when you shoot the feather projectile. And I really like them. I think they look nice. Other than that, I figured I need some sort of death particle for when the bird projectile hits an enemy. Not necessarily for the enemy, but for the projectile itself. Because right now, it would just disappear, and then the enemy would take damage. And that was really underwhelming. I thought it would be really cool if there was some sort of feedback, right? Like there was an oomph to it. So to add in that oomph, I figured, well, why don't I add in particles? So I added some death particle code to the general projectile class. So now all projectiles can have this death particle if I want them to. And I went in and I made a very basic death particle for the feather projectile. Now, my first attempt at making this death particle amusingly looked really, really good, but it looked like water, not feathers, because I figured this feather was being destroyed, right? So maybe I should use triangles to represent the parts of that feather that have been broken apart. And those triangles, because they're blue, ended up looking very, very much like a splash of water, which looks great, but is not a feather. So I went in and I redid that whole particle setup, and I did it using the actual feather sprite itself. So now the particles that spawned looked very much like they were part of the feather, like very poofy, and I really like this because now I love the particles coming off of the bird projectile, and when you shoot in an enemy, there's a ton of feathers just everywhere and plumage going crazy, and it looks fantastic, so I'm really happy with that. After that, I decided to work on the actual avatar switching mechanic for the player because I have 2 avatars now. It's time to figure out how to switch between them. The first step to that was just figuring out how to tell the player to switch avatars, regardless of any game mechanics or any artwork or anything. Just figure out how do I switch characters in the player code. And that was really simple because all you have to do to switch avatars is change a node, right? This avatar node gets deleted and I replace it with this avatar node. This is a little bit deceivingly simple because you have to worry about the fact that the previous avatar node doesn't leave the game right away. So when you delete things in Godot, at least if you delete them like you're supposed to, you use the queue free code and the queue free function. And what this function does is it removes it when it's safe to remove it, right? Because when a node exists inside the game, a lot of other nodes and objects are relying on that node being there, and that node's doing stuff. So if you just go ahead and remove it from the game without any warning, all those nodes that are relying on it being there just freak out and crash, right? So you have to say, hey, remove this from the game when you have the opportunity to, otherwise bad things are going to happen. Because of this, it doesn't necessarily get removed right away. It's almost right away, but not quite. And in computer world, not quite right away means when you run statements right after the statement that's not quite right away, they're going to run before it gets finished. So what all this means is if you try to delete that node and then immediately add in a new node, there's going to be 2 avatar nodes, and the game has to label one of them as like avatar 2 or avatar 3. Then, when the other previous avatar node finally does remove itself, there's now only an avatar 2 node. And the main game is like, wait, there's only supposed to be an avatar node here. What do I do? And it dies and crashes. And that's exactly the sound computers make when they can't figure out what they need to do and they crash. So this was a really, really simple fix. All you need to do was cache the new node that had to get added and add it in on the removal of the previous node. And either you could cache it as a variable inside the main script, or you could cache it as another node with a different name under the script. Either solution works fine and gets the job done. So after I finished that, I needed a more mechanical way for the player to change between the avatar because obviously they don't have the same code capacities that I, as the game developer, have in this particular game, right? So to that end, it's as much a game design problem as it is a programming problem because there's lots of different ways that this could be implemented. And right now I have 2 mainly floating around in my head, both coming from very different games and both with their strengths and weaknesses, I think. So the first one is what I like to call the Lego Batman solution because you have these locations that you walk to and it swaps your avatar with an existing avatar that's there. Maybe you do something at that location for the swap to happen, right? This has the benefit of limiting when the player can change avatar. So as the designer, I can say, hey, in this zone, you're not going to have access to this avatar nearly as much, or you're going to have access to this avatar. Maybe you should use this avatar to solve this problem. Because if I throw, for example, flying enemies to the player, the bunny does not have a way to interact with flying enemies. There's nothing it can do against it. But the bird avatar has that flight ability they can use to shoot the enemies. So maybe I give the player access to the bird avatar there, and I sort of hint to them, hey, you should switch to this, and it gives them a nudge in the right direction. In addition to that, I can hide away these changed locations behind different puzzles or different enemies to solve, and it can make a very interesting, dynamic game environment. And I think this is something that was, again, the more I think about it, the more the old Lego Batman game actually had really good game design. Because that's something that those old games did really well, because you would like solve a puzzle and then change to a character and then use that character to solve another puzzle and change to a character, and that's something that could be used in my game moving forward into the future. The other game design philosophy that I'm looking at is having the players somehow change avatars through some sort of combo mid-combat, because when I changed avatars using the little debug key I had in my keyboard, it was actually really fun to fight things with both avatars because you had more options, right? So you would, for example, I would like burrow under an enemy with the bunny, and then I would switch to the bird and fly away from it really quick, and then shoot it with a feather while I was at a distance. And then maybe there's a crowd, so I swap to the bunny again, and then I use stop on the crowd really quick. And that sort of in-the-moment, fast-paced decision-making actually makes combat really, really fun. The downside to this, of course, is that the more options the player has, I can't limit those options somehow. So if I have a location and I don't necessarily want them to be able to get through that location right away, or I don't want them to be able to have access to a certain avatar in a certain location, I can't do that if they have access to the avatars everywhere. So I'm almost thinking of somehow combining the two solutions in the future, but for the time being, I needed a way to make a sort of bare-bones skeleton version of them that I could test up and running. And I figured, okay, if I'm going to do that, the Lego Batman one, the Lego Batman solution, I can't get over that ridiculous name, is going to be the more simpler solution to implement. More simpler, if that's a valid word. But the point is, it'll be easier to implement because I have code in existence already that actually will be very helpful for completing the situation. So previously, I had worked on some code to have statues that you would sing to, and then those statues would cause something in the game world to happen. So maybe, like, the idea is you have to sing to the statue to open a door, or to open a chest, or to get health, or to make enemies spawn. It's basically like, it's a song-based way of interacting with the world. So in other games, you'll press the A key to open a chest. In this game, you play a song, because you're playing with the piano, right? Well, I figured I can reuse this code for the statue swapper enemy, so you have to play a scale to swap, right? And this was actually really simple to implement, so I went in and simple isn't exactly what I used to describe it. It was simple in the sense I didn't have to rewrite a lot of code. What was a little bit challenging was going in and rereading my old code, because it's been a long time since I made these things, and when you look back at old code, is not your code anymore, right? It's very, very foreign to look back at it. So there's definitely a learning experience there. And one of the things that really helped me, and I would highly recommend to anyone who's programming anything over multiple different files, to at the top of every single file, just give a quick blurb of what the point of the file is. At least if hopefully you would have your files designed in such a way that they're modular enough that you could do something like that. Because that quick SparkNotes version at the top of my classes really helped me figure out what was going on with the old code that I did, and it helped me get to the point where I could much quicker implement this new feature much more quickly. So once that was done, I went in, I tested it, and it worked great. You switch between avatars, and then the avatar would switch out into these changing statues that I had to go in and whip up for the artwork. And yeah, it was really nice. The one downside to this, though, is that I wanted the player to play in the mode that they're going to switch to when they switch modes, right? So if you're switching to the bird avatar, who represents the Mixolydian mode, why would you play in the major scale, right? And the bunny avatar, by default, is in the major scale. And the statues are designed to match the scale that the player is in. So they don't care about the scale, they just care about the scale degree, right? So if you're talking to a statue and you're in the major scale, you play notes in the major scale, which is not what we want when we change avatars. And this is definitely a feature, and it's not a bug, right? Because when you make combos to interact with the world, you don't want to have to remake them for every single different mode. So you have to use the scale degrees instead of the individual notes of the scale. But in this one instance, it actually hurts you more than it helps you for a design reason that you should play in the scale that you're switching to. This was a really simple fix. I just had the statue change the player's scale to match whatever scale it was going to when the player entered the statue zone. So even though it would display the major scale avatar, the actual player itself would know that, hey, I need to play in the mode that I'm switching to. And this worked really well. I would go as the bunny to change to the bird, and instead of playing the major mode, I would play the Mixolydian mode. And then same thing with the bird. Instead of playing the Mixolydian mode, I would play the major mode. Actually, I don't think it's called the major mode. Whatever the weird Latin word that people use for it is. I think it's like Ionian mode? Yeah, whatever. It's a music theory concept. I don't really care. Major mode. So, yeah, it worked great. The one downside to this, however, is that if the player has been playing this avatar up till this point, right, they've been moving around completely in this mode previously. If that mode suddenly changes, it's going to be a shock to the player. And we don't want it to be a shock to them, right? We want them to... anything in the game that throws them off like that is bad. We don't want them to just suddenly find out, oh, wait, it's not responding to my keyboard inputs now. What the heck do I do? So to that end, I needed a way to indicate to the player that, hey, you need to use different notes than you've been previously using. So I figured, okay, what if I have a way to highlight notes that are different between two different modes? So I went in and I whipped up a really nice function that determines if a note is the same in both modes, right? If a scale degree is the same across two different modes. And then I use this function to highlight scale degrees that are different inside the dialogue that the statue presents to the player. And I really like the solution. It shows very, very clearly what notes need to be played different. But the more I started thinking about it, the more it doesn't necessarily make sense to have the difference between two notes, because the notes that are highlighted will not be the same depending on if the combinations between the avatars are different. So yes, they're always going to be the same between the major mode and the Mixolydian mode, but if I switch to like the Locrian mode, for example, and I try to change to the major mode, it's not going to highlight the same notes as if I change from the Mixolydian mode to the major node, because it's focusing on the difference between the two modes, not necessarily on the individual modes themselves, right? So the issue with this is that it'll take the player, again, it'll confuse them for a second, because they'll have to think, okay, this represents notes that are different on my mode, not that are just different for me to play. And I thought about this for a little bit, and I really do think that the solution to this is have everything in reference to the major mode. And this might seem like it's coming out of left field, but it makes a lot of sense when you sit down and think about it, because the way modes work in music theory, at least modes that are all based on the key of C, right? So if all of your modes are based in C, so C, C major, C Mixolydian, C minor, C Aeolian, C whatever, they're always going to range from C to C, but you're going to change the white and black notes of that mode. So because of this, the only, and I repeat, the only mode that uses all white notes in the piano is the major mode. So if you test for which notes are different between the major mode and any other mode, what you're actually testing for is which notes in those other modes are black notes, right? Because if they're white notes, they have to be in the major mode if, again, the modes are from C to C. Since the game uses modes that are from C to C, that's the solution I ended up going with. So in the future, if I ever have, like, again, a low-grade enemy, which would probably be a spider, which that's a cool thing to add in the future. That's way down the line, though. I'm not going to worry about that now. But if I do ever end up adding some sort of spider avatar, right? When that avatar switches to... When you switch to that avatar, you're always going to get the same note indications as you would regardless of the avatar that you're coming from. It's always going to tell you what the black notes you need to press are, and you're always going to be able to interpret that from what's given on the display. It's a lot more consistent, and hopefully it'll be more intuitive for the player in the long run. Admittedly, this is one of those things that I should probably go in and playtest, and it's kind of hard to tell if that's the better solution because I only have 2 avatars now, and you really need 3 to completely test that. But I'm pretty happy with it as is, and it makes sense thinking about it, and I really do think that this is the better way to go as opposed to having it in reference to the 2 different scales. But yeah, once I had that implemented, I could switch between avatars, and the player had a mechanical switch between them. It was finally time to change the bird, or the bunny statue, from a bunny statue to a bird statue. Because really what this giant spider cage is going to do, right? It's going to hold one of these switcher statues captive so the player can't use it. So I was finally ready to go in and change it from a bunny to a bird. And then I didn't. Because what these statues need to do is they need to be varying, right? So the statue needs to be able to be any avatar. So I went in and I wrote code so that the statue could change to any type of avatar. So it doesn't necessarily have to be bird or bunny. I could substitute it for anything. And I ended up just leaving it as bunny in my test zone because, yeah, I like the bunny avatar. It was the first one. And once I went in that, I started writing code so that when the statue removes all the spider legs, it would actually remove itself from the tree and add a switcher statue, one of the switching ones from before. So basically, it would replace itself with one of the statues that lets you switch avatars. Oh, this feature was buggy as heck. It's still buggy as heck, and I need to go in and fix a lot of the issues with it. So for whatever reason, and there's 2 different ways the blocker statue removes itself from the tree. Either the blocker statue removes itself when the first time you complete all bosses, it'll remove itself that way, or it removes itself after it has seen that you have previously completed those 3 bosses, and both of those have slightly different properties to them. When it added in the switcher statue when it has completed all 3 bosses, so when it's previously seen, hey, you've already beaten the 3 bosses, don't even run the animations, it didn't even add it. Like, it would remove itself from the tree and then nothing would get added, and then when it did the other method, so you had just killed all 3 bosses, you removed all the legs from it and it added a statue, it would add it properly, but then the statue would not respond to the player entering it at all for some strange reason. So I spent lots of time working on this, and eventually it was actually getting pretty late when I was working on this feature. I said, I just need to take a break from this, step away from the keyboard for a little bit. So this is going to be something that I have to fix next week, is getting that blocker statue turning into the switching statue properly once you've defeated all of the bosses. Really, I think I need to go ahead and look at this blocker statue code again, because it's been the source of all sorts of trouble throughout development, and that typically is a good sign that I can do better with it, and it needs to be cleaned. But yeah, once I get that in, that hopefully will be running really nicely. The player will have a way to switch. I still need to go in and find a way to maybe have the player some sort of combo to change avatars mid-combat, or maybe a solution that I really like is to let the switching statues give the player charges, and then let the player expend those charges to use some sort of combo. So like, they'll expend a charge, and that charge will turn them into the bird avatar. Or they'll expend a charge, and that charge will turn them into the bunny avatar. So then I can limit their options, but they can have lots of options stored to switch between avatars. After I did that, and after I took a break from working on the blocker avatar, I figured, okay, maybe I should step away and work on some smaller features of the game that maybe I would otherwise procrastinate indefinitely because they're small and easy to do. The first of which being the lurker enemies. The lurker previously did not care about the layer the player was in. It would just say, hey, is the thing that entered me an enemy or a player? And if so, damage it. Not what we want, right? We want it to hit players and enemies who are in a specific layer. So, to that end, I went in and I just added a really quick check to check if it was in the layers the lurker was looking for. This is, again, really simple fix. I already have all the collision mass saved off in their own library, and I just reused that library there. The other fix that I went in and added really quickly was the game crashing when you played a wrong note. So, previously, when you played a wrong note, when you were using a MIDI instrument that was not in the mode that you were in, the game would just crash, right? It would go, I don't know what to do with this note, and make the lovely sound computers make when they crash. Blah, blah, blah. And, and then it would die. So that doesn't happen anymore, hopefully. I actually didn't test this feature. I'm testing it live now, and it seems like it's working okay, maybe. We'll see what Editor David says about it. But, yeah, that was pretty much it. Next week, the biggest priority will be getting that blocker statue spawning in the switcher statue properly. After that, maybe looking in at figuring out how to add a combo system so the player can change between avatars mid-combat and see if I like that and see how that works. I could hopefully reuse an existing combo node for that, but again, that'll take a lot of research before I can start working on it properly. Other than that, once I have the system to switch avatars, I really need to work on the 3rd zone for the major scale area and getting that statue enemy and then the statue boss and all of that stuff worked out and filling out properly, because every zone is hopefully going to have 3 bosses to fight. But yeah, that's pretty much it for week 8. See you next week.